Good morning to you all. As has been highlighted for us, and in this case read, we are commencing our new series, Christ or Chaos. It will be going from this week over the next 5 weeks and will be topical in nature, somewhat similar to the series that we had just finished, Lex Rex, The Law is King, where we'll be examining a number of passages and exegeting them in a more topical or thematic sense. The primary purpose, and I kind of gleaned on this last week, but the primary purpose of this will be almost an application or continuation, I suppose you could say, of what we learnt in Lex Rex, where we saw the establishment of the principles of the law of God, where we examined its bases and how it then obviously played up to the final kind of penultimate conclusion in what we looked at with Romans 13. This will then kind of be the so what of that series. The what kind of application and implication does this fact, this reality, that it is indeed God who has ordered society and who orders his law after his own character, what implications does that then have? Today we will be also laying down some fundamental principles, and there will be application, but a lot of the application from today will be coming in and kind of intertwined with the weeks that then follow. That is the broad, very baseline outline and rule of what we will be examining. Before we kick off, just a very few, couple of announcements just briefly. One is that those who are visiting, the church lunch that was mentioned back in the announcements, we have places that are available. If you would like to come, it's free of charge. And so if you would like to come, around midday down at the Katoomba RSL, you are welcome to join us, and that is free of charge for you. Secondly is that, as Michael mentioned, we're transitioning obviously in the Bible study, and I will be picking that up kind of here on out. For those who are interested, who have either been part of the Bible study or who are looking to join the Bible study, whichever category you fall into, if you can meet me out the back in morning tea, you grab your coffee, grab your biscuits, and then come and find me wherever I happen to be, just so I can get a more direct lay of the land, see what we're working with, and we can talk briefly about kind of what we want to do in terms of planning, logistically, mainly things about how often, or all these kinds of things. So just in the morning tea afterwards. Finally, and in brevity, a bit of wisdom and advice for us all, myself to be reminded of at this particular time when we are being flooded in the 24-hour news cycle with the events that are going on in Eastern Europe. It becomes very easy, as we have sometimes seen over the last 2 years especially, to become very enveloped and enraptured by what is going on out there beyond us. It can become very easy to be emotionally enraptured, to become very kind of intellectually or even spiritually invested in what's going on. And it's not that we shouldn't care, we absolutely should. But all I am simply advising us to do is be wise in what we deliberate over, be wise in what we invest our spiritual and our psychological and our mental and emotional health over, because the reality is that we are sitting here, and apart from getting on a plane, there is virtually nothing that you and I can do about what's going on. It absolutely matters. It's actually a really important thing to talk about. And there is a million things that could be said. But let's not lose sight of our job here. Let's not lose focus, and let's not become bogged down spiritually or psychologically or emotionally. Does that make sense? Yeah, just some good advice for us all, myself included, to remember. I'm happy to talk about the issue with people down at lunch. The history of Russia is one of my wheelhouses that I studied quite often in my history studies. I'd be happy to talk about it, but just that little bit of advice. So, Genesis 1. We will actually be primarily focusing here this morning on really it's kind of verses 1 and 2. We had 3 to 5 highlighted for us as well, which is what then kicks off the first day and kicks off that then process of creation as we have framed for us in Genesis chapter 1. But the primary focus will be upon those first 2 verses, verses 1 and verses 2. And what we'll be doing is establishing fundamental principles, especially around the concept of chaos and the concept of what God is doing here, namely ordering chaos, taking chaos and then ordering it. There are a million different roads which this subject alone can go down. There is an infinite length of strings and connections that can be drawn just from these two verses. It's almost like the old cop shows you'd have where the detective would be in the smoke-filled room and he's got plastered all over his office the photos and the newspaper clippings and the criminal reports, and he's got the red string going all around the room, and he's been awake for 4 days, driven purely by coffee at that point. That's kind of what happens to Daniel Thomas when he starts getting off the leash talking about this subject. So if I get to a point where someone has to come up and cinch in a rear naked choke and put me to sleep, go right ahead. This is a fascinating subject that can be drawn to so many different ends across so many different concepts. So this is not comprehensive. This is simply a foundational sermon to lay down fundamental principles. Okay? Let's look at verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Very familiar to us. Famous words, widely known even beyond Christian circles. But these words formulate for us, along with what we then have in the next verse, but this sentence, particularly in verse 1, is the incipit of the entire scriptures. It's the title page, so to speak. It is the opening line that then informs ultimately theologically, metaphysically and thematically what comes throughout the entirety of the scriptures that then follow. Whilst being contextually relevant to Genesis 1, it really indeed actually establishes the premises upon which the entire scriptures come, theologically, literarily and otherwise. And when we think particularly about the context in which this was written, approximately, roughly speaking, 3,500 years ago, in a deeply pagan Mesopotamian culture, these words become even more extravagant and even more unbelievable to read. Despite how familiar they are to us, the words, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, are so familiar and seem so obvious, and that's a good thing. But these words written in that time were so countercultural, were so foreign to the very fundamental religious and cultural premises that existed in that time, that it is vital that we, so many thousands of years later, actually understand the kind of impact of the nature of what that meant. The reality that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth stood against the major, what's called cosmogony or creation mythos that existed in Mesopotamia at that point in ancient Sumeria and Arcadia, right, the predecessors culturally to Babylon. And not that that informs specifically this, or not that this is specifically and only written as kind of a polemic against the dominant creation myth, but it's something that is contextually written very plainly and very obviously in that time period and delivered in that fashion in order to actually provide the true standing and the true theology of how indeed the world was created. The reality that it is God who in the beginning created. Why is that important? Why is that actually vital to every single possible area of Christian theology that you can think of? For a variety of reasons. Let's examine the first one. The concept of in the beginning. It is a very necessary phrase. It is something that's vital to then understanding what's being written. But the concept that in the beginning, a direct pointing to a specific period in time, it is inherently a claim that time itself had a beginning. You see, the fundamental and dominant creation mythos, the theology that virtually all cultures have held down throughout the ages, especially in this time in the ancient world, is that what you can broadly call the creation, although it becomes a bit weird to use that term, but certainly the materials of creation have always existed. They are eternal. They are pre-existent. Many of the broadest and most dominant cosmogonies, creation mythos of ancient times, you will find the gods coming forth from the primordial elements. The very word chaos from the Greek speaks to the reality of the pre-existent and the eternal, from which the first generation of the gods came, from which these personifications, like Nyx, the night, and others, like Chronos, time, the very progenitors of the successive generations of the gods which you are more familiar with, like Zeus, Hades, Poseidon, Hermes, various of the other gods. They are the successive generations that came from these predecessor gods, but they themselves came from pre-existing material. They came from this primordial material. In the very day and the cultural context in Mesopotamia in which this is being written, the dominant Babylonian creation myth is in brevity that of Apsu and Tiamat, the ancient waters, and they sprung forth from that. And all the gods that came from Mesopotamia, the most famous of being Marduk, who we find many times throughout the Old Testament, the Babylonian patron god, come forth from these two gods, Apsu and Tiamat, the goddess of chaos, the goddess of the abyss. The reality that it is in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. This shorthand, all-encapsulating term referring to all that exists. The heavens and the earth being a shorthand for what we would just simply call the universe. The earth, space, time, matter, all the stars, the planets and the hosts therein. That stands in absolute diametric opposition to what everyone else believed, to what every other cultural civilization at that time believed, and what virtually every cultural civilization down throughout the ages has believed outside of the Judeo-Christian context. This distinction of a pre-existent and eternal God who, in the beginning, a direct explanation that time itself was measured from this point of in the beginning, thereby created and therefore afterwards created the heavens and the earth, is imperative for us understanding everything else that gets written in Genesis 1. What we have in this chapter, ultimately, as much valuable, and I mean that, as much valuable scientific information as you can utilise from this, as much of the various areas of science that can interact with Genesis 1, which is good and valuable. Genesis 1 as a chapter, at least broadly, is not a science textbook, and that's okay, right? Because the purpose here is a very important and specific dramatic or poetic rendering, an explanation of the Christian creation mythos. Now, the word mythos, just as a very brief aside, because it will be a word that will naturally come up a lot here. We, in the current kind of cultural context, especially this many years after the Enlightenment era, the word myth in the common conceptualization has essentially only a negative connotation. Myth essentially has become just basically a synonym for a lie or an untrue story, right? That's not the history of the word, especially not in the Greek. No one in ancient time, no one in ancient Greece used the word mythos that way, explicitly. No one over the last 2,000 years, up until its kind of adaptation, post-Enlightenment, used that word mythos that way. Mythos is simply speaking to, or just myth in English, is speaking to, namely, a story of origin, right? That can have elements that are entirely true, that are partly true, that are mixtures, that are anything, okay? But our understanding of God being the creator, as opposed to the gods coming from the primordial chaos, from the material, from the creation itself in essence, which really isn't a creation, which is eternal in their view, absolutely important to our very worldview of understanding not just our place therein, but rather our place before God. Do you see? Our very position of how we relate to the universe in which we exist is impacted by this particular reality, is deeply and inescapably impacted by the fact that we sit here right now at this particular point in time in a world physically, in the first point, that is constant, that is ordered, that then flows forth to the spiritual or metaphysical realities of the world that are ordered. Because really the overarching point of what we are seeing in these opening verses of Genesis, and more importantly in Genesis 1 as a whole, is an important declaration that indeed this one true God, who is eternal, who existed before the very things that are being described herein, has ordered chaos. We'll see that in a little bit when we explain some of the more broader linguistic structure of Genesis 1. But we've been hearing about this chaos, and what is that? Well, let's continue on into verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, these words might seem, on the one hand, simple, and perhaps even on the other hand, somewhat mysterious or esoteric, somewhat almost obscure, using very broad terms here, and it's sometimes hard to actually understand what's going on here. And that's not, to a fault. What we are doing here, unfortunately, is inevitably running into those areas of theology where we kind of run headfirst into the limits of our own mortal minds and the limitations of our finite intellectual capabilities. Even something like I mentioned earlier about the eternal existence of God. We have no ability to conceptualize what on earth that truly means. Words or phrases like me explaining that God existed before the beginning of the universe. The word beginning only has meaning by very virtue of the fact that time itself had a beginning. So what existed before time? Right, we run headfirst into this issue. It's like the Trinity, almost a little bit like communion when we looked at that too, and that's okay. But what we can do is actually mine out here and exegete the principles and mine out the theology that is there for us. Okay? But it is important to understand that what we are reading here in verses 1 and 2 is actually profoundly deep. From both a theological sense, from a philosophical sense, from a metaphysical sense. And I will do my best to try and exegete that and to try and bring that down to our level so that we can then understand and encapsulate exactly what's going on here. Let's look at the first half. The earth was without form and void. Those two words, without form or formless, empty, you could also translate that as, and void. These two particular words are ones that actually feature a number of times throughout the scriptures. One more than the other. The literal phrase here would be tohu vabohu in the Hebrew. Right? So they sound very similar and they're speaking to similar concepts. They just kind of have different flavours or different kind of angles that you can look at it from. right? And the word that you would be translating here as without form or formless is used a little bit more often, right? But the word bohu that you're translating here as void is used only 3 times in the entire Old Testament. One of them being here, and the other one being actually a quotation of this particular passage. But it might be helpful for us to look at them just in brevity, so that we can then begin to explain and open up the kind of theological points that are being drawn here. Let's first, which one do I go to? Let's go to Isaiah 34 first. Isaiah 34. Isaiah 34. Let's begin. Let's go from verse 8. Actually, I'll read the context just a bit broader so we can understand what's going on here. In verse 1, right, this is a declaration of judgment against the nations. Isaiah is an incredibly prophetic book. It has a lot of very comparatively wild and vivid and colourful imagery and metaphors and symbolism that is employed constantly throughout, both against the people of Israel, right, who have rebelled against God, who have followed after idols and false gods and so on, as well as against the nations. Here, we are getting one against the nations. Right, in this case, it's a general sense. Elsewhere, Isaiah is actually declaring judgment against Egypt specifically. Right, that's why it begins in verse 1 of chapter 34 by saying, "Draw near, O nations, to hear and give attention, O peoples." Let's jump forward to verse 8 and where it starts to really pick up. "For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion. And the streams of Edom shall be turned into pitch, and her soil into sulphur. Her land shall become burning pitch. Night and day it shall not be quenched, its smoke shall go up forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste, none shall pass through it forever and ever." What we're having here, right, and we often kind of miss this sometimes in our modern context, this is not a literal description of an absolute quasi-nuclear apocalyptic event that's going to occur. This is what the Old Testament prophets do over and over and over again, and in certain instances in the New Testament as well. We've referenced this before. It's called dramatic prophetic hyperbole. Okay, dramatic prophetic hyperbole. It is the deployment of massively, terrifyingly awe-inspiring language and rhetoric, particularly in the form of symbolism, heavy symbolism, as a pronouncement of especially judgment, right? Or of current, or of either the current state or of things that are going to occur. Okay? It's dramatic. It's almost theatrical in one sense. And it's that way purposefully. Here, we have yet another example of that. Right? Their smoke shall go up forever and ever. They will lie waste for generation after generation. No one will pass through it. Right? The streams of Edom will turn into pitch. No one in the day should have been going out and looking at any of the streams or the rivers near Edom and looking for it to turn into pitch. That's not what was going to happen. It's a decriment of judgment, namely in the form of what's called, in theological terms, decreation language. That'll come up as more important in a little bit. Decreation language. But let's keep reading. From verse 11. "But the pelican and the porcupine shall possess it. The owl and the raven shall dwell in it. He shall stretch out the line of tohu, of confusion, of emptiness, and the plumb line of bohu, of emptiness, of void." The exact same words, tohu and bohu, from Genesis 1 are being used here. Why? Why is Isaiah here employing the use of those words that were describing this state of chaos in which the world existed, in which the universe and matter existed before God then ordered it? This particular point, right, as well as the one we're going to see from another passage in a minute, is vital to us understanding this concept of even the idea of Christ or chaos. In essence, what we are seeing here, referencing back to Genesis 1, to this state in which the earth was formless and void. It was this state of chaos, of darkness, in which nothing had been ordered, nothing had sprung forth in terms of the land, the plants, the animals, humanity, nothing. Even the stars and the hosts of heaven. It was formless and void. It was this primordial chaos that had not been directed, moulded, crafted, and created by God. It was everything that one does not want. And instead, this God then ordered that chaos. The referencing of those words, tohu and bohu, are not just literarily, but in this particular case, especially for those in Isaiah's day who are hearing this and who are then contextually understanding those words, it is a hearkening back to that state of being. In essence, it is somewhat of a threat. It's a threat. It's a pronouncement of judgment in the context of rampant sin, rebellion, idolatry, and so on. And here in the midst of this very vivid and dramatic imagery and symbolism being delivered, that's designed to shock people. Here he is referencing back to that state of primordial chaos, and that is what he will turn the people and their society and culture into. Wow. We see this done all the time throughout the scriptures. Once you understand what you're looking at, you'll see it everywhere. Right? Isaiah does it over and over again. Right? One of the more famous pieces of decreation language that you're probably familiar with. Isaiah uses it both against the people of Israel, the covenant breakers, and against Egypt. Right? Many of the Old Testament prophets use it. It also features in the New. Right? And the famous piece goes like this. The sun shall be darkened, the moon shall no longer give its light, and the stars of heaven shall be cast down. Who's heard of that one? Yep. The point is not to sit around waiting till the nightfall to then walk outside, look up, and then see whether or not the moon or the stars are still there. It is vivid language where God, the very God, who created the sun, the moon, and the stars, is in this case shutting off the light of the sun, darkening the moon which reflects it, and then tearing away the stars from the heavens. He is reversing the creation. He is decreating in this vivid symbolic image that we're being given. It's a statement of a transition from order back to a state of chaos. It's the reversal of God's inherent work of ordering the universe. And what's interesting here, by the way, verse 11, you'll remember from Genesis 2 that it says, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Right? The actual word that we're translating there out of the Hebrew is as hovering. Most of your translations should say hovering in English. Used not very often, but the imagery that's being drawn in the Hebrew is that of a bird hovering, particularly that of an eagle. Right? That's why so often in the Old Testament God is referred to using the symbolism of a bird or an eagle particularly, right? Of raising you up on eagle's wings, of this image of him floating above and hovering above the nest of his people. Right? It's used that way in Deuteronomy 32, actually describing Moses and the people of Israel, that God was hovering over the nest, literally the same action, right, of hovering over the waters. Right? God is used often in this symbolism of protecting his people, of nurturing them like a mother bird almost, right? Protecting them under the refuge of his wing, using that symbolism. And birds feature as an element. Right? They're not just something to glean over because they're referenced for a particular reason. The bird that went out from the ark, as an example, after which God had flooded the world with the waters, chaos, destruction, disorder, he first sent out what bird? A raven. Just like here. And it came back with what? Nothing. It did not find dry land. It did not find refuge from these waters, from this chaos, from this destruction and judgment. But then another bird got sent out, right? The dove. A white dove, as opposed to a black raven. A dove, and bringing back an olive branch. The birds being mentioned here are actually somewhat important to us understanding this concept of chaos and understanding what's being referenced with this imagery of the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. The fact that he is referred to the Spirit of God in this bird-like imagery of hovering over in the Hebrew rather, stands in contrast to these birds. The pelican, a seabird that spends much of its time eating from the seas, from the waters, which have been used all throughout the Old Testament, including in this passage of Genesis, as symbolism for chaos. There is then the owl, a predatory bird of the night, of darkness, and a raven, a black bird that is a scavenger, is a carrion, right? That feasts primarily upon death. That's why the raven, especially in northern Germanic cultures, the Celts, the Anglo-Saxons, the Norse, the Danes, was used as a symbol of war. Because the raven would so often be featured on the battlefield after all the dead corpses lay there. These are unclean birds. These are birds that are representing symbolically darkness, destruction, chaos. Right? And were literally unclean for that reason under the ceremonial law. The symbolism that we're finding here is the kind of pathway from which we can understand what's going on in Genesis 1. When we see that this God, particularly in reference to the Spirit hovering above these waters, hovering above this primordial chaos that existed, this formless and void earth, to even call it that. This universe, this primordial darkness, no light, no shape, no structure, no framework, no order. We still fundamentally believe as Christians, and it's important to, that the world was created, to use a Latin term, ex nihilo, right, out of nothing, because that's the distinction. That's what we get from Genesis 1:1, that in the beginning, a statement about the beginning of time, God created the heavens and the earth. But when he created this state that first existed of this primordial chaos, it was not to be left alone, but rather it was then to be almost the canvas upon which he would paint the formless or shapeless piece of clay that the potter would then work into what he would go on to call very good. That's why the book of Genesis, and particularly that of Genesis 1, is so structured in the way it is. When you actually read literally through Genesis 1, forgetting even just the content, forgetting what specifically is made on each day, right, which is an entirely different discussion, but when you look at the way it's actually written, you'll see that there's a very repetitious structure. And God said, dun, 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 and it was so, dun, 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 and God saw that it was good, dun, 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 evening, morning, the somethingth day, the first day, the second day. And just repeats itself through the 6 days. That's not a mistake. That's not just a coincidental literary factor of the creation of that particular chapter. The very literary structure of what we read in Genesis 1 is all about the proclamation and declaration of this God who has ordered the universe and has done it in an orderly fashion. When the religions and the ideologies and the cults of the world, so many of them, the vast majority of them, the overwhelming majority of them, have come from and descended from worldviews of pre-existent eternal chaos from which the gods then spring forth. And usually not just one generation, but successive generations, as is the case in Mesopotamia, as was the case in Egypt, as was the case in the Indus Valley, as was the case in Greece, as was the case in the north, and in so many other places. And then the gods that actually ended up standing were simply the ones that defeated the other gods. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth that I referenced earlier, about Apsu and Tiamat coming forward from these primordial pre-existent waters, is all about war. The reason why Marduk is featured in the Bible as the god, the preeminent god, the king god of Babylon, is because he's the one that slayed Tiamat, the goddess of chaos, and built the world from her corpse. The Greeks and all the gods which you're familiar with, of Zeus, of Poseidon, of Hades, of Athena, of Artemis, they are the ones who went to war against the gods who came before them, and they were victorious. And they imprisoned them in the eternal prison of Tartarus. And they now reign from Mount Olympus. It's all chaos. And it's not order. It is gods who went to war with each other, and whichever ones came out victorious now ran the show. And indeed, even then, in most of the ideologies and the creation mythos of the world, humanity was created almost singularly and solely for the purpose of almost slave-like service to the gods. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, which Genesis 1 is being written in contemporaneously with, humanity was only created to make sure, to simplify it, that Tiamat did not rise again, to help Marduk and the gods keep chaos at bay. That was it. Is that at all what we find in Genesis 1, let alone Genesis 2? No. It's the exact opposite of that. And so this reality that God, singular, pre-existent, existing before anything in the universe, informs for us that indeed he stands above, beyond all of creation itself. It goes on to inform us, therefore, that he created this formless and void primordial matter, this chaos. Not that it would remain that way, not that other gods would come forward from it, but rather that he would then be the God who ordered the chaos, who ordered the universe. And his very character, his very attributes are displayed constantly and everywhere through that ordering. And so many of the passages in the Old Testament, so many, like in Isaiah or in Jeremiah or in Ezekiel or many of the other prophets, is a prophetic foretelling of exactly what happens when you abandon this God of order, of exactly what happens when you turn away to idols made from the creation. He says in one of his most famous polemics, one of his most famous words against the false gods, in Jeremiah 7, He says in verse 11, interestingly, by switching out of Hebrew and speaking in Aramaic, the language of the nations, so they will be very clear about what's being said. And the Lord God says what? All the gods who did not create the heavens and the earth shall be crushed, shall perish from the earth and beneath the heavens. The gods who have come forward from creation, I will destroy you upon that earth and beneath those heavens. I will destroy you. You'll be crushed in and beneath the very thing that you have come forth from. No matter whether it is wooden idols and statues that have to be moved around and that can't clean themselves, that can't even offer themselves food, or whether it is the idols of the human heart, whether it is the idols that exist in our culture, where at least the ancients had at least the modicum of respect to create gods that were really just the fruition of themselves, that were so often murderous, that were so often drunkard, that were so often sexually repulsive and degenerate. At least they had enough baseline respect to actually bother to create deities. This day and age, we just simply create idols from among our own people. Our own emotions become our own idols. Our own desires are our own idols. Our own material gain is so often our own idol in our society. Our own hedonistic desires and lusts in life of any kind, stripe or variety are often our idols. Other human beings, so-called celebrities, that for some reason are meant to be celebrated, become our idols. What happens when societies or a culture abandon the God of order? When they abandon the very fundamental worldview of this God who has indeed ordered the world? Well, we're told time and time again, the prophets through centuries and indeed through millennia proclaimed over and over that those who abandon the order, those who abandon the God of that order, he will descend them back into chaos. He will descend them back culturally, spiritually or otherwise, back into a state resembling that primordial darkness and chaos where there was no light, where there wasn't even a path. And he says that actually. He says that in places like Psalm 107. He uses the word bohu, formless, and says that he will make, in that particular judgment, he will make the princes to tread a formless path or a trackless wilderness. Literally, a wilderness of chaos. Do you recall in Psalm 119, I believe it is, right? The Lord is a light, his word is a light unto my path. Well, God says that when those people abandon me, when they rebel against me, I'm not even going to just take away the light, I'll take away the path. Wow. You will see nothing, you will hear nothing, and everything that has goodness and order and truth and justice and righteousness, I will wipe away. If you want to abandon the God of order, I will give you chaos, is what he says. When we understand this idea of chaos, when we understand the very reality, the imperative reality, that it is the one true God who has ordered the universe out of this primordial chaos, how does that impact our worldview? How does that impact how we live? How does that impact us on an individual level? How does that impact us operating as a church? How does that impact our society, our culture? These are the kind of questions which are going to be coming up across our series. These are the kind of things that we're going to be examining. Particularly what happens when individuals, groups, cultures and societies abandon the God of order and instead choose, by definition, chaos. Remember this: the one true God who existed before all has created all. In, through, by, and for Jesus Christ, we are told. All throughout the New Testament. When you see in verse 3 onward, God saying, "Let there be light," when you see the Lord speaking in Genesis 1, we are told in the New Testament that is Christ speaking. That is the very God who came in flesh upon the earth, who we read about. That is him so long ago speaking order and speaking the formation of creation into being. That's the God who we worship. We do not worship gods or anything so pathetic as to have come forward from creation or from the world itself. We do not worship idols that can't even move themselves, pathetically and impotently standing there doing a whole lot of nothing. And we do not have the audacity to turn our own emotions and machinations, our own lusts and desires into great idols, nor any other man. We worship the one true God. We worship the God of order. We worship the only one through whom this world and this universe make any sense at all. And he, as the one who existed before, who exists today and shall exist forevermore, stands as our King and stands as the one true sovereign who orders our lives.